Story 1. Silent watchers. The graffiti showed a police officer, a severed head dripping blood onto a child's playground. I stopped my car in the parking lot of what should have been a peaceful small-town park and stared at the spray-painted horror covering every surface around me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. This was supposed to be Orange Cove, California. Population 3,000. A quiet farming community where families stopped for picnic lunches during long drives through the Central Valley. Instead, I was looking at the most violent artwork I'd ever seen outside a maximum security prison. The mural stretched across the entire side of the public restroom building. Dismembered police officers, gang symbols I recognized from my years covering crime in Los Angeles. And worse things involving children and violence that made my stomach turn over. But what made my blood run cold was how fresh it looked. The paint was still bright, no fading from sun or weather. Someone had created this recently, and nobody had bothered to clean it up. I am Marcus Rodriguez, and I've been a news photographer for 23 years. They documented gang wars in East LA, natural disasters across 3 states, and political corruption that sent mayors to prison. I thought I'd seen everything that small-town America could throw at me. I was wrong. The park should have been full of families on a Saturday afternoon. Instead, it was completely empty except for my rental car and a massive pickup truck that someone had parked directly behind a dumpster. The truck was positioned so that any vehicle trying to leave would have to squeeze through a gap barely wide enough for a motorcycle. I only stopped because my GPS had died somewhere near Fresno, and I needed directions to get back to the highway. What I found instead was a town that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The playground equipment looked normal from a distance, but as I walked closer, I saw that every swing had been cut down. The chains hung loose, ending in jagged metal where the seats used to be. The monkey bars were bent at impossible angles, twisted by incredible force into shapes that looked almost like symbols. And everywhere, more graffiti. Not random vandalism, but organized messages, territory markers, warnings in both English and Spanish that made it clear this wasn't just some teenage prank. This was a declaration of war painted in broad daylight for anyone brave enough to read it. I pulled out my camera and started shooting. The journalist in me recognized a story worth investigating, even if the human in me wanted to get back in the car and drive away as fast as possible. That's when I noticed the watchers. They stood in doorways and behind windows of houses surrounding the park. Silent figures who didn't move when I looked directly at them, but shifted position whenever I turned away. Men in dark clothing, women clutching children, elderly faces peering through curtains that snapped shut the moment I raised my camera. The whole town was watching me, not with curiosity or friendliness, but with the kind of intense attention that predators give to prey, like they were evaluating whether I represented a threat or an opportunity. I finished photographing the graffiti and walked back toward my car, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. The pickup truck was still there, still blocking most of the exit. But now there was someone sitting in the driver's seat, engine running, waiting. The driver was a young man, maybe 25, with the kind of muscular build that comes from hard physical work. His face was expressionless, but his eyes tracked my every movement with mechanical precision. When I waved at him, hoping to signal that I needed to leave, he didn't respond at all. I got in my car and started the engine, hoping he would move his truck once he realized I was trying to exit. Instead, he shifted into reverse and backed up until his bumper was almost touching my front grille. Now I was completely boxed in, with the dumpster on one side and his truck on the other. The watchers had moved closer. They stood on the sidewalk now, maybe 30 people arranged in a loose circle around the park. Still silent, still staring. Men, women, children, all wearing the same blank expression of focused attention. I tried honking my horn to get the truck driver's attention. The sound echoed through the empty streets, but nobody reacted. Not the driver, not the watchers, not the curtain twitchers in their windows. It was like the whole town had agreed to pretend they couldn't hear me. My cell phone showed no signal bars. Not unusual for rural California, but the timing felt wrong. I had full service when I entered Orange Cove 20 minutes earlier. Now the phone was completely dead, not even showing emergency call options. That's when I started to understand what was happening. This wasn't random. The truck placement, the watchers, the dead phone signal. Someone had been monitoring my arrival and coordinating a response. They wanted me trapped here for reasons I couldn't begin to guess. I put the car in reverse and carefully backed up until I felt my bumper touch something solid. A quick glance in the mirror showed another truck had appeared behind me while I was focused on the one in front. Same model, same dark color, same silent driver with dead eyes. Now I was truly boxed in, with nowhere to go and an audience that seemed to be growing by the minute. The watchers had been joined by more people emerging from houses and businesses. They formed concentric circles around the park, like they were gathering for some kind of ceremony. But they still weren't making any sound. No talking, no shouting, no attempt to communicate with me at all. They just stood there and watched with the kind of patience that suggested they'd done this before. I tried to remember what I knew about Orange Cove. Small agricultural community, largely Hispanic population, economic problems like most Central Valley towns. But nothing in my research had mentioned gang activity or the kind of systematic intimidation I was experiencing. The graffiti told a different story. The symbols I photographed weren't random tags or artistic expression. They were territorial markers from one of California's most violent prison gangs, painted with the confidence of people who knew no authority would challenge them. Orange Cove wasn't just a quiet farming town. It was a controlled territory where normal laws didn't apply, and outsiders who stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time simply disappeared. The truck driver in front of me finally moved, but not to let me pass. He shifted into drive and slowly pulled forward until his bumper was inches from my windshield. Close enough that I could see his face clearly through both windshields. He was smiling now, not with humor or friendliness, but with the cold satisfaction of someone who enjoyed having power over others. His lips moved like he was talking to himself, or maybe to someone I couldn't see in the passenger seat. The watchers began moving inward, tightening their circle around my car. They walked with synchronized steps, like they rehearsed this choreography many times before. Still silent, still staring, but now close enough that I could see details I wished I hadn't noticed. Many of them carried things. Not weapons exactly, but tools that could become weapons if necessary. Hammers, screwdrivers, heavy wrenches. Work implements that wouldn't attract attention from casual observers but could cause serious damage if used with bad intentions. I realized that Orange Cove had developed a system for dealing with unwanted visitors. The graffiti in the park wasn't just gang artwork. It was bait, a lure designed to attract exactly the kind of person I was. Someone curious enough to stop and investigate instead of driving through without looking too closely. Once someone took the bait, the trap would activate, block the exits, surround the target, wait for them to understand their situation. Then what? Robbery? Worse? Or maybe they just wanted to send a message about what happened to outsiders who showed too much interest in their business. The truck behind me started honking its horn in short, rhythmic bursts. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The universal SOS signal, but played backward and wrong, like a mockery of distress calls. Other vehicles had appeared around the park, as perimeter. Not just trucks, but vans and SUVs with tinted windows positioned to block every street leading out of the area. Orange Cove had mobilized its entire population to contain one confused photographer who made the mistake of stopping in the wrong place. But why? What were they so desperate to hide? I thought about the graffiti again, especially the fresh paint and professional quality artwork. This wasn't the work of amateur vandals. Someone with serious artistic skill had spent hours creating those murals, and they'd done it with the town. This full knowledge and cooperation. Maybe Orange Cove wasn't just tolerating gang activity. Maybe the gangs had taken over completely, turning the entire community into a base of operations disguised as a sleepy farming town. The perfect cover for drug trafficking, human smuggling, or whatever other businesses required isolation from law enforcement oversight. The watchers were close enough now that I could smell their sweat and see the details of their faces. Ordinary people, mostly. Farmers and shop owners and retirees who looked like they should be worried about mortgage payments and grandchildren's birthday parties. Instead, they stared at me with the focused intensity of hunting animals. One woman caught my attention. She was maybe 60 years old, wearing a floral dress that belonged in a church service or garden party. But her eyes held the same cold calculation I'd seen in the faces of career criminals. She carried a large kitchen knife with the casual familiarity of someone who knew exactly how to use it. The truck driver revved his engine, a deep rumbling that vibrated through my car's frame. Other engines answered from around the circle, creating a symphony of mechanical threats that made my teeth ache. I was running out of time and options. Whatever they had planned for me, it would happen soon. The coordination was too perfect. The trap too well executed for this to end with a simple warning to leave town and never come back. But I still had one advantage they might not expect. My camera had been recording videos since I started photographing the graffiti. Everything that had happened in the last 30 minutes was documented in high-definition detail, stored on multiple memory cards hidden throughout my equipment bag. If I didn't make it out of Orange Cove, at least there would be evidence of what had happened. Proof that this town harbored secrets worth killing to protect. Someone would eventually find my car and my camera, and then the whole story would come to light. The woman with the kitchen knife stepped forward, raising her free hand to signal the others. This was it. Whatever they had planned was about to begin. But instead of advancing on my car, something unexpected happened. The watchers began backing away, their organized formation dissolving into confused retreat. Engines shut off one by one, and the trucks blocking my exit began moving aside. In the distance, I could hear sirens approaching from multiple directions. Not one or two vehicles, but what sounded like a major law enforcement response rolling toward Orange Cove at high speed. The truck driver in front of me threw his vehicle into reverse and backed away so fast his tires squealed against the pavement. Within seconds, the park was empty except for my rental car and the horrible graffiti that had started this whole nightmare. I didn't wait to see who was coming or why the entire population of Orange Cove had suddenly decided to disappear. I put my car in drive and headed for the nearest highway, pushing the speed limit as far as I dared until the town was nothing but a dark memory in my rearview mirror. Later, I tried researching what had happened. The sirens I heard never resulted in any news reports. No arrests, no investigations, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred in Orange Cove that Saturday afternoon. But when I developed the photos from my camera, I found something that still keeps me awake at night. In the background of several shots, barely visible behind the graffitied restroom building, were rows of fresh graves marked with simple wooden crosses. Orange Cove, its secret wasn't just gang activity or drug trafficking. It was something much worse, something that required them to silence anyone who looked too closely at their carefully maintained facade of small-town normalcy. I never published those photographs, never filed a story about what I experienced, because some truths are too dangerous to share, and some places are protected by forces that reach far beyond local law enforcement. But I kept the memory cards, hidden where nobody will ever find them. Evidence of a town where ordinary people become monsters when their secrets are threatened, and where curiosity can be a fatal mistake. If you ever find yourself driving through California, this Central Valley, and you see a sign pointing toward Orange Cove, keep driving. Dawn, to stop for gas. Dawn, to take pictures, and dawn, to ask questions about the artwork in the park. Some small towns have secrets worth killing for. Orange Cove is one of them. Story 2. Watchers of Manly. The road on my GPS didn't exist. I was staring at 3 different routes to the same location, and none of them matched what I was seeing through my windshield in the backwoods of Louisiana. My name is Jake Morrison, and I install cell phone towers for a living. 38 years old, divorced, no kids, just me in whatever remote location needs better signal coverage. The job takes me to forgotten corners of America where most people never venture. But nothing had prepared me for Manly, Louisiana. The work order said I needed to survey a site 15 miles outside town for a new tower installation. Simple job: drive out, take measurements, photograph the terrain, file a report. Should have been done in 4 hours. Instead, I'd been driving in circles for 2 hours, following roads that led nowhere and streets that appeared on one map but not another. That's when I saw the first abandoned house. It sat maybe 50 yards off the main road, if you could call the cracked asphalt strip I was following a main road. The house looked like it had been beautiful once. 2 stories, wraparound porch, the kind of southern architecture that belonged in magazine spreads about gracious living. But now the windows were boarded up with sheets of plywood, and the roof had caved in on the left side. What made my skin crawl was how recently it had been abandoned. The lawn was overgrown but not completely wild. A child's bicycle lay on its side in the driveway, chrome still shining, tires still holding air. Like the family had just walked away one day and never come back. I pulled over and checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't unusual in rural Louisiana. But the GPS was acting strange, showing my location as a blue dot floating in empty white space. According to the satellite data, I was driving through uninhabited wilderness. No roads, no buildings, no signs of human presence for miles in any direction. Except I could see power lines running along the road, fresh tire tracks in the mud, a mailbox at the end of the abandoned house, this driveway with the flag still up, waiting for mail that would never come. I got out of my truck to stretch my legs and figure out where exactly I was. The silence hit me immediately. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but the oppressive silence of a place where all the normal sounds had been sucked away. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no wind rustling through the trees. Just dead, heavy air that made my ears ring. That's when I heard the dogs. Not barking or howling, but something worse. A low whining sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Like a pack of animals in distress, crying for help that wasn't coming. The sound led me around to the back of the abandoned house, where I found a sight that made my stomach turn. 3 dogs chained to posts in what used to be the backyard. German shepherds, probably beautiful animals once, now reduced to skin and bones. They were alive but barely, tongues hanging out, eyes dull with desperation. Someone had left them there to starve. Not animal control or law enforcement doing a necessary but unpleasant job. Someone who wanted these dogs to suffer before they died. I ran back to my truck and grabbed the emergency water bottles I always carried. The dogs were so weak they could barely lift their heads to drink, but they managed a few desperate laps before collapsing back onto the dirt. While I was trying to figure out how to help them, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud around the water bowls. Boot prints, size 11 or 12, with a distinctive tread pattern. Someone had been here recently, checking on the dogs, making sure they were dying on schedule. That realization sent ice water through my veins. This wasn't the abandoned property that had been forgotten. Someone was actively using this place for something horrible, and I had just stumbled into the middle of it. I called 911, forgetting that my phone had no signal. But when I looked at the screen, it showed full bars and a clear connection. The call went through immediately. The dispatcher sounded friendly and professional, asking about my location and the nature of the emergency. But when I tried to describe where I was, the words wouldn't come out right. I kept saying I was near Manly, Louisiana, but the dispatcher kept asking me to repeat myself, like she couldn't understand what I was saying. Finally, she told me animal control would be dispatched to my location within the hour. Then the line went dead, and my phone went back to showing no signal. I waited by the truck, watching the dogs and trying to make sense of what was happening. The GPS was still showing me as a floating dot in empty space, but now it was displaying a new route back to the main highway. A route that definitely hadn't been there when I arrived. That's when I saw the man watching me from the tree line. He stood maybe 100 yards away, perfectly still, just observing. Middle-aged, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt like any rural Louisiana resident. But something about his posture made the hair on my arms stand up. He wasn't hiding or trying to avoid being seen. He was studying me with the kind of focused attention that predators give to potential prey. I raised my hand and waved, hoping to seem friendly and non-threatening. He didn't respond, didn't wave back, didn't move at all. Just kept staring with an intensity that made my mouth go dry. I decided it was time to leave. The dogs would have to wait for animal control, and I would file my report based on whatever information I could gather from the main road. But when I got back in my truck and tried to start it, the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was fine. The lights worked, but the engine just clicked uselessly when I turned the key. Like something had been disconnected while I was dealing with the dogs. The man in the tree line had moved closer. Now he was maybe 50 yards away. Still watching, still perfectly motionless. I could see his face clearly now, and what I saw there made my blood freeze. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile or even a cruel one, something else entirely. The kind of expression that suggested he was enjoying a private joke that I wouldn't understand until it was too late. I popped the hood and checked the engine. Everything looked normal, but not much of a mechanic. The battery connections were tight, the oil level was fine, nothing obviously wrong. But the truck was as dead as if someone had removed the entire engine. When I looked up from the engine compartment, there were more watchers. 3 men now, positioned at different points around the clearing. All middle-aged, all wearing similar clothes, all watching me with that same disturbing smile. They didn't approach or threaten me directly. They just stood there like sentinels, marking my position, making sure I understood that I was surrounded and they knew exactly where I was. I tried my phone again, hoping to reach a tow truck or roadside assistance. This time I got a signal, but when I called AAA, the operator told me they had no record of my membership. When I tried my credit card company, they said my account didn't exist. Every number I called gave me the same response. No record, no account, no service available. It was like my entire identity had been erased while I stood in that backyard trying to help 3 dying dogs. The watchers had multiplied again. Now there were 6 of them, forming a loose circle around the abandoned property. They maintained their distance but kept me in clear sight, communicating with each other through subtle gestures I couldn't interpret. I realized they had been tracking me long before I noticed them. Probably since I first entered their territory, following my progress on roads that didn't appear on any official map. They knew I was coming before I did, had prepared for my arrival, and were now implementing whatever plan they had for dealing with unwanted visitors. The sun was getting lower, and the thought of being trapped here after dark filled me with panic that made it hard to think clearly. I had to do something, make some kind of move, before whatever they had planned moved into its next phase. I started walking toward the nearest watcher, hands visible and empty, trying to project non-threatening curiosity rather than fear. Maybe if I could talk to one of them, establish some kind of communication, I could figure out what they wanted and how to get out of this situation. But as soon as I took the first step in his direction, all 6 watchers began moving. Not toward me, but to new positions that would cut off any escape route I might attempt. They moved with practiced coordination, like they had done this many times before. When I stopped walking, they stopped too. When I took a step back toward my truck, they adjusted their positions again. Always maintaining their circle, always keeping me contained, always watching with those terrible smiles. I was being herded, manipulated, led through a sequence of actions that they had planned and rehearsed. But toward what end? What did they want from a random cell tower technician who had gotten lost on back roads? The answer came when I heard vehicles approaching from the main road. Not the animal control truck I was expecting, but multiple engines moving in convoy formation. Whatever was coming, it was big enough to require significant transportation. The watchers heard it too. Their smiles grew wider, and several of them pulled out cell phones and began texting rapidly, coordinating with the approaching vehicles, updating them on my status and position. I had walked into a trap that had been waiting for exactly this kind of situation. A system designed to catch and hold anyone who ventured too far off the approved routes, who saw too much, who asked too many questions about places that weren't supposed to exist. The convoy consisted of 3 pickup trucks and a van, all painted flat black with tinted windows. They pulled into the clearing and parked in formation, blocking every possible exit route. Engines stayed running, doors stayed closed. But I could see silhouettes moving inside the vehicles, preparing for whatever came next. One of the original watchers approached my truck, still smiling that horrible smile. He stopped just outside arm's reach and spoke for the first time since this nightmare began. He told me that he and his friends had been following my every move since I entered their territory that morning. They knew where I stopped, what I photographed, who I tried to call. They had been tracking me like hunters following wounded prey, waiting for the perfect moment to close their trap. Then he asked if I had enjoyed meeting the dogs. The casual way he said it, like he was asking about the weather, made me realize the full scope of what I had stumbled into. The abandoned houses, the starving animals, the roads that didn't match any map. None of it was accidental. It was all part of an elaborate system designed to lure curious outsiders into situations where they could be isolated and controlled. Manly, Louisiana, wasn't just a small town with some unusual residents. It was a hunting preserve where people like me were the prey, and locals like these watchers were the predators who enjoyed making the hunt last as long as possible. The van's sliding door opened, and 3 more men got out. These weren't locals in flannel shirts and jeans. They wore tactical gear and moved with military precision, like professionals called in to handle a situation that had moved beyond the capabilities of the amateur watchers. I was out of time and options. Whatever they had planned for me was about to begin, and there would be no rescue coming. No one knew where I was, and according to their maps, I wasn't anywhere at all. But I still had one advantage they might not expect. My work truck was equipped with an emergency beacon that automatically activated if the vehicle remained stationary for more than 6 hours in a remote location. Company policy, designed to help find technicians who got lost or injured in the field. The beacon had been active for 4 hours. In 2 more hours, it would start broadcasting my exact coordinates to company dispatch, along with an automated distress signal that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. I just had to survive that long. The professional-looking men from the van were setting up equipment that I recognized as signal jamming gear. Military-grade electronics designed to block all communications in and out of a specific area. They were preparing to erase me as completely as they had erased this corner of Louisiana from official maps. But they were 2 hours too late. My beacon was already active, already counting down to a rescue they couldn't prevent. All I had to do was stay alive until help arrived, and hope that help would be enough to overcome whatever resources these watchers had at their disposal. The smiling man stepped closer, close enough that I could smell tobacco and something else on his breath. Something metallic and unpleasant that reminded me of blood. He told me that Manly, Louisiana, had been disappeared from most official records decades ago. A bureaucratic accident that had never been corrected, leaving the community free to develop its own laws and customs without outside interference. They had learned to be self-sufficient in all things, including entertainment. I was their entertainment for the evening, and they intended to make it last as long as possible. Story 3. Skidmore cursed the whole town was watching me. Not staring directly, nothing that obvious, but I could feel their eyes tracking my movements as I walked down the main street of Skidmore, Missouri. Population 263 according to the faded sign at the town limits. Every person I passed had that same look, a mix of curiosity and something darker. Like they were measuring me for something I couldn't understand. I'd come to Skidmore as an insurance investigator, looking into a series of bizarre claims filed by residents over the past 18 months. Property damage, livestock deaths, mysterious fires. All from a town so small it barely qualified as a dot on the map. My company wanted to know if we were dealing with fraud or something more complicated. I was about to discover it was much more complicated than anyone imagined. The first thing that struck me about Skidmore was the silence. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of oppressive hush that falls over a room when someone mentions the dead. Even the children played without making noise, their games conducted in whispers and meaningful glances. I booked a room at the only motel in town, a rundown place called the Prairie Inn that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1975. The clerk, a thin woman named Ruth with gray hair and hollow eyes, barely looked up when I checked in. She just slid me a key attached to a plastic tag shaped like a corn cob and pointed toward the back of the building. My room smelled like cigarettes and mothballs. The wallpaper was peeling, and the carpet had stains that could have been anything. But what bothered me most was the window. It faced directly toward the town center, giving me a clear view of the main intersection and the small cluster of buildings that made up downtown Skidmore. From my window, I could see people gathering. Not a crowd exactly, but individuals drifting toward the center of town like iron filings drawn to a magnet. By the time the sun started setting, maybe 30 people had assembled in loose groups around the intersection. They weren't talking or moving much. Just standing, waiting. For what? I had no idea. I grabbed my case files and decided to get some dinner at the diner across the street. Maybe I could strike up conversations with locals, gather some background information about the insurance claims. The moment I walked into Mabel's cafe, every conversation stopped. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me with the same measured expression I'd been getting all day. A mixture of assessment and anticipation. The waitress, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes and a nervous smile, approached my table with obvious reluctance. I ordered coffee and a burger, trying to project friendly professionalism. The waitress, whose name tag read Dolores, brought my food without making eye contact. When I tried to ask about the recent troubles in town, she glanced toward the other customers before shaking her head. That's when I noticed something disturbing about the other diners. They were all eating the same thing, meat that looked undercooked and vegetables that seemed to glisten with an oily sheen. The smell coming from their plates was wrong somehow. Sweet and metallic, like copper pennies left in the sun. And they were all watching me eat my normal-looking burger with expressions that might have been envy. After dinner, I walked back toward the motel. The groups of people were still gathered at the intersection, but now they were arranged in a rough circle. Their heads were bowed like they were praying, but their lips weren't moving. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. As I passed the outer edge of the circle, an elderly man looked up and made eye contact. His pupils were dilated so wide his eyes looked black, and when he smiled, I saw that his teeth were stained dark red. I hurried back to my room and locked the door. That night, I started researching Skidmore as history online. What I found made my blood run cold. This tiny farming community had been the site of some of the most disturbing crimes in Missouri history. In 1981, the town bully was shot to death in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses. Not one person would admit to seeing anything. The case was never solved. More recently, a pregnant woman had been murdered and her unborn child cut from her body. The crime was so brutal it made national news, but it was just one in a series of violent incidents that plagued the town. Livestock mutilations, house fires that burned in perfect circles, leaving the surrounding grass untouched. Children who disappeared for days, only to return with no memory of where they'd been and strange marks on their skin. Every incident followed the same pattern: brutal, inexplicable, and met with complete silence from the community. But the most disturbing thing I found was a pattern in the timing. The violent incidents occurred in clusters, roughly every 7 years, always coinciding with the arrival of outsiders in town. Insurance investigators, reporters, social workers, people like me. I was reading about the latest cluster of incidents when I heard the singing. Soft at first, drifting through the thin walls of the motel room. Multiple voices harmonizing in a melody that sounded ancient and wrong. The kind of song that makes your teeth ache and your vision blur around the edges. I looked out my window toward the town center. The circle of people had grown larger, maybe 50 individuals now, all swaying slightly as they sang. In the center of the circle, something was happening. The asphalt at the intersection was changing. It started as a small dark spot, like an oil stain. But as I watched, it spread outward in a perfect circle, the surface of the road rippling like water. Steam or smoke rose from the expanding circle, and the streetlights above began to flicker and dim. The singing grew louder. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. The screen showed full bars, but every call went to dead air. Even 911 wouldn't connect. That's when I realized the singing was coming from inside the walls. Not through them, from inside them, like the voices were embedded in the very structure of the building, seeping through plaster and wood grain. I pressed my ear to the wall and could hear dozens of people singing, their voices muffled but clear. Singing about hunger, about feeding time, about the visitor who would help them grow stronger. I ran for my car. The parking lot was empty except for my rental. But as I fumbled with the keys, I noticed something that made my hands shake. Every other parking space had oil stains. Fresh ones, like cars had been parked there recently, leaking fluids onto the asphalt. Cars that were no longer there. My engine turned over on the third try, and I peeled out of the parking lot toward the highway. In my rearview mirror, I could see the circle of people breaking apart. They were walking toward the motel with purpose now, no longer content to wait and watch. But when I reached the town limits, my car died. The engine didn't sputter or make grinding noises. It just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. All the lights went out. Even my phone died, the screen going black despite showing a full charge moments before. I was trapped in complete darkness on a country road with something approaching from behind. Footsteps on gravel, dozens of them, moving in perfect synchronization, like a marching army. I tried to restart the car, pumping the gas and turning the key frantically. Nothing. The footsteps got closer. Through my rear window, I could see lights moving through the darkness. Not flashlights or torches. These lights came from within the people carrying them, a soft phosphorescent glow that emanated from their skin like they were walking lanterns. I abandoned the car and ran into the cornfield beside the road. The stalks were tall and thick, providing cover as I stumbled through the rows. Behind me, I could hear the search party spreading out, their glowing forms visible above the corn as they swept the field in a grid pattern. But they weren't just searching randomly. They were hurting me. Every time I tried to turn back toward the highway, I see another glowing figure blocking my path. They were driving me deeper into the field, toward something waiting in the center. I fought my way through the corn for what felt like hours. My clothes were torn, my hands bleeding from the sharp leaves. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing where the corn had been cut away in another perfect circle. In the center of the clearing stood a farmhouse that shouldn't have existed. It was old, maybe a century or more, but perfectly preserved. White paint that gleamed in the moonlight. A wraparound porch with rocking chairs that swayed gently in the windless night. Warm light spilled from the windows, and I could smell something cooking. Something that reminded me of the metallic sweetness from the diner. The front door was open, and I could see people moving around inside. Normal people in normal clothes, cooking and eating and going about their evening routines like any family in any farmhouse in rural Missouri. Except they were all people I'd seen in town that day. The motel clerk, the waitress, the man with the stained teeth, and sitting at the head of the dinner table, smiling and gesturing for me to come inside, was a woman I recognized from the old newspaper articles. Bobby Jo Stinnett, the pregnant woman who had been murdered 15 years ago. She looked exactly the same as in her photos. Young, blonde, with a kind face and bright eyes. Except now her belly was swollen with pregnancy again, and when she waved at me, I could see the surgical scar across her abdomen where her child had been cut away. The scar was still bleeding. I ran back into the corn, crashing through the stalks without caring about direction. The glowing figures were everywhere now, their light filtering through the corn like moonbeams through stained glass. But I kept running until I broke through the edge of the field and found myself back on the highway. My car was exactly where I left it, engine running, headlights bright. I didn't question the impossibility. I just drove. I made it to Kansas City by dawn and caught the first flight back to Chicago. Told my company that Skidmore was a dead end, that the claims were probably fraudulent but not worth pursuing. They dropped the investigation, but 3 months later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a birth certificate for a baby born in Skidmore, Missouri, 2 weeks after my visit. The mother was listed as Bobby Jo Stinnett. The father was listed as unknown visitor. At the bottom of the certificate, someone had written in red ink, "He is growing so fast. Can't wait for you to meet him." They've moved twice since then. Changed jobs, changed my name. But every few months, I get another update. Photos of a child who looks disturbingly like me, taken in locations I recognize. My old apartment building, my office, places I haven't been in years. The child is aging rapidly. In the most recent photo, he looks about 12 years old. Old enough to travel, old enough to search, and written on the back of every photo is the same message: Daddy is coming home soon. Because that is what Skidmore does. It doesn't just kill outsiders, it breeds them. It creates new residents to feed the hunger that lives beneath the town. And once they contributed to that hunger, once your essence becomes part of their breeding program, you belong to them forever. The curse of Skidmore ISN to random violence. It is family planning. Story 4. Phantom of Purple Head Bridge. The purple glow in my rearview mirror wasn't supposed to be real. I am a 38-year-old engineer from Springfield, and I don't believe in ghost stories. But 3 weeks ago, I found myself parked at midnight on the Wabash Cannonball Bridge in St. Francisville, Illinois, honking my horn 3 times like some teenager on a dare. What appeared in my mirror that night changed everything I thought I knew about reality. I'd come to St. Francisville for work, surveying old railroad infrastructure for potential renovation. The town has maybe 800 people, most of them farmers or retirees who live there their whole lives. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and strangers get noticed. I was staying at a bed and breakfast run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson. She was friendly enough, but every time I mentioned the bridge, her expression would shift, like I brought up something she'd rather forget. The Wabash Cannonball Bridge spans a deep ravine about 2 miles outside town. It's an old railroad trestle that hasn't seen a train in decades, converted for car traffic with wooden planks laid across the steel framework. During the day, it is just another piece of rural infrastructure. At night, according to local legend, it becomes something else entirely. The story goes that if you park your car in the center of the bridge at midnight, turn off your lights, and honk 3 times, you'll see the purple head. A disembodied, glowing skull that appears in your mirrors or floats outside your windows. Most people say it's the ghost of a railroad worker who was decapitated in a train accident back in the 1940s. I heard dozens of variations of the story from locals during my week in town. Everyone had a friend who tried it or knew someone who had. But nobody would admit to doing it themselves. They just get that same look Mrs. Patterson had, like they were remembering something they wish they could forget. Professional curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I was just testing local folklore for my survey report. Understanding community beliefs about infrastructure could be relevant for renovation planning. It was a rationalization, but it got me in my rental car that Friday night at 11:45. The drive to the bridge took 15 minutes on winding country roads. No streetlights, just my headlights cutting through darkness thick enough to feel solid. The bridge appeared suddenly around a bend, a skeletal silhouette against the star-filled sky. I parked exactly in the center, where the wooden planks creaked under my car. This way. Through the gaps, I could see the ravine dropping away into absolute blackness. The silence was complete. No traffic, no wind, no night sounds at all. At exactly midnight, I turned off my headlights. The darkness was so total it felt like being blind. I couldn't see my own hands on the steering wheel. My phone's clock showed 12 a.m. in glowing digits that seemed impossibly bright in the void. I pressed the horn 3 times. The sound echoed off the ravine walls, bouncing back and forth until it faded into silence. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, feeling slightly ridiculous, when something changed in my rearview mirror. A faint purple glow, like the light from an old television screen. It started as just a shimmer, barely visible in the corner of the mirror. But as I watched, it grew brighter and more defined, taking shape, becoming something that made my rational mind reject what my eyes were seeing. A human head, floating 3 feet behind my car. Not a skull like the stories suggested, but a complete head with features. A man, his face, middle-aged, with kind eyes and a sad expression. The purple glow came from within, like he was lit from inside by some otherworldly energy. He was looking directly at me through the mirror. I should have started the car and driven away. Every instinct screamed at me to get off that bridge, but something about his expression held me frozen. He didn't look threatening or evil. He looked desperate, like he was trying to communicate something urgent. The head moved closer to my car, and I could see more details. A railroad worker, cap, a uniform from decades past, fresh blood on his neck where it had been severed from his body. But what terrified me most were his lips. They were moving, forming words I couldn't hear through the glass. I rolled down my window. The moment the barrier between us disappeared, sound rushed in. Not his voice, but something far worse. The screaming of metal on metal, the hiss of steam, the thunderous roar of a locomotive bearing down at impossible speed. And underneath it all, his voice, weak but desperate, repeating the same phrase over and over. Get them off the tracks. Get them off the tracks. I looked around wildly, but we were alone on the bridge. No train, no tracks in use, no one to warn. But the sounds grew louder, more real, until I could feel the vibration of approaching wheels through the bridge structure. The purple head was right outside my window now, close enough to touch. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tight. You have to warn them, he said, and his voice cut through the phantom train sounds like a knife. They coming back tonight, just like before. Get them off the tracks. What tracks? I shouted over the growing noise. There's no train. But even as I said it, I realized I was wrong. The wooden planks beneath my car were changing, transforming back into railroad ties and steel rails. The modern safety barriers were dissolving, replaced by nothing but empty air on either side of narrow train tracks suspended over the ravine. And in the distance, growing brighter by the second, was the headlight of an approaching locomotive. The Wabash Cannonball, running its route exactly as it had in 1947, on the night it derailed and killed 12 people, including the brakeman whose head now floated beside my car, trying to prevent the same tragedy from happening again. The teenagers, he said, his voice urgent. They come every Friday. They park their cars on the tracks for the thrill. They don. You know the train still runs. As if summoned by his words. Headlights appeared at the far end of the bridge. A pickup truck, moving slowly toward the center of the span. I could see silhouettes inside. Young people laughing and pointing, unaware that they were driving onto active railroad tracks. The phantom locomotive was maybe half a mile away now, its whistle screaming through the night. But the teenagers couldn't hear it, couldn't see it. They existed in their own time, while I was trapped between past and present, watching history prepare to repeat itself. I had maybe 2 minutes before the collision. I started my car and drove toward the pickup, flashing my lights and honking my horn. But they couldn't see me any more than they could see the approaching train. I was a ghost to them, just as the purple head was to most people. But the brakeman could affect the physical world. He'd proven that by changing the bridge around us. Can you stop the train? I yelled. He shook his head, his expression anguished. I tried that night. Died trying, but I can. He changed the past. Then changed the present. The locomotive was close enough now that I could see the engineer, his face. said in concentration as he drove his phantom freight toward catastrophe. The teenagers had stopped their truck in the exact center of the bridge, right where my car had been moments before. The purple head looked at me with something that might have been hope, then vanished. For a moment, nothing happened. The train bore down on the unsuspecting teenagers while I watched helplessly from the side of the bridge where I pulled over. Then the pickup truck's engine died. The lights went out. The radio cut to static. In the sudden darkness, I heard one of the teenagers curse in confusion. Heard car doors opening as they got out to check what was wrong. They were off the tracks. The Wabash Cannonball roared through the spot where their truck sat, a wall of phantom steel and steam that passed through the vehicle like it was made of mist. The train was real enough to kill but not real enough to collide with objects from the present. As the locomotive disappeared into the distance, the teenagers' truck came back to life. Their headlights flickered on, their engine turned over, and I watched them drive away into the night, never knowing how close they'd come to joining the casualties of a 75-year-old train wreck. The bridge returned to normal. Wooden planks, modern barriers, empty silence. But the purple head appeared one more time in my rearview mirror. He was smiling now, the desperate urgency gone from his features. He looked peaceful for the first time since I'd seen him. He mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Then he faded away, and I was alone on the bridge. I drove back to Mrs. Patterson, this bed and breakfast in a daze. When I told her what had happened, she just nodded like she had been expecting it. "Harold Morrison," she said, "the brakeman who died in the wreck. He's been trying to save people ever since. Most folks just see the purple light and run. You're the first one who stayed long enough to help him. Has he appeared to others? Every Friday night for decades. But the teenagers keep coming, thinking it is just a game." Harold could usually scare them off, but sometimes she trailed off, staring out the window toward the bridge. Sometimes the timing is just wrong. I left St. Francisville the next morning, but not before filing a report recommending that the bridge be closed to vehicle traffic. "Too structurally unsound," I wrote. "Safety concerns." It was approved within a month, but 6 weeks later, I got a call from Mrs. Patterson. The town council had voted to reopen the bridge. Tourism, they said. The Purple Head legend was bringing in visitors, and the local economy needed the boost. They installed new signs advertising the ghost story, complete with historical information about the train wreck and instructions for summoning the spirit. I tried to warn them about what I experienced, but they thought I was just another tourist with an overactive imagination. Last Friday, exactly 3 months after my encounter, 5 teenagers died in a car accident on the Purple Head Bridge. Their vehicle went through the safety barrier and plunged into the ravine. The official cause was listed as mechanical failure. But I know the truth. Harold Morrison is still trying to save people, still appearing every Friday at midnight, hoping someone will understand his warning. But there are only so many times he can change reality. Only so many nights he can hold back the past. And sooner or later, the Wabash Cannonball always reaches its destination. The purple glow in the mirror I ascend to just a ghost story. It is a countdown timer. And time is running out. Story 5. Gas station. The fuel gauge hit empty as the Texas sun disappeared behind the pine trees. And I knew I had made a terrible mistake. My name is Miguel Santos, and I am a long-haul trucker who has driven every highway in America for 15 years. I know which truck stops are safe at night and which towns you never enter after dark. But on this October evening, exhaustion and poor planning had left me with no choice. The GPS showed only one gas station for the next 50 miles, and it was in Jasper, Texas. Every trucker knows about Jasper. In 1998, 3 white men chained a black man named James Byrd Jr. to the back of their pickup truck and dragged him to death along a country road. The crime shocked the nation, but those of us who drive these routes knew the truth. Jasper had always been a sundown town, a place where people like me were not welcome after the sun went down. My Mexican father and Lebanese mother had given me olive skin and dark features that made small-town racists nervous. I had learned to time my fuel stops carefully to avoid certain areas when darkness fell. But tonight, with my diesel tank running on fumes and my logbook demanding I stop driving, I had no choice. The gas station sat alone on Highway 296, a single island of fluorescent light surrounded by towering pine forest. The building looked like it had not been updated since the 1970s, with faded paint and rusted metal signs advertising cigarette brands that no longer existed. Only 2 other vehicles were parked in the lot, a beat-up pickup truck and a sedan with Louisiana plates. I pulled my 18-wheeler up to the diesel pumps and climbed down from the cab. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of pine needles. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree line, I could hear the distant sound of voices, but I could not make out words. The station attendant was a thin white man in his 60s with yellow teeth and suspicious eyes. He watched me through the bulletproof glass as I swiped my credit card at the pump. When the card was declined, I had no choice but to go inside and pay cash. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I entered the store. The attendant did not look up from his newspaper, but I felt his eyes following my every movement. The shelves were stocked with overpriced snacks and energy drinks, and everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. As I approached the counter with a $20 bill, the man finally spoke. His voice was gravelly from years of smoking. "You picked a strange night to be passing through." I asked what he meant, but he just shook his head and took my money. Through the window behind him, I could see my truck at the diesel pump. The fuel was flowing slowly, and I realized it would take at least 10 minutes to fill the tank. That was when I noticed the shadows. At first, I thought they were just trees swaying in the wind. But as I watched more carefully, I could see humanoid shapes moving between the pines at the edge of the parking lot. They seemed to be gathering, forming a loose circle around the gas station. The attendant must have seen my expression change because he glanced over his shoulder toward the window. When he turned back to me, his face had gone pale. "You need to leave," he whispered. "Right now." But my truck was still taking on fuel. The digital display showed I had only pumped 12 gallons, and I needed at least 40 to make it to the next safe stop. I told him I would wait in my cab until the tank was full. "No," he said, more urgently now. "You do not understand. They come out after dark. They have been watching you since you pulled in." Through the window, I could see the shadows more clearly now. There were at least a dozen figures standing just beyond the reach of the parking lot lights. They were not moving toward the station, but they were not leaving either. They were waiting. The attendant reached under the counter and pulled out an old double-barreled shotgun. His hands were shaking as he checked the shells. This happens sometimes. Travelers who look different, who do not belong here. They surround the station and wait. Most of the time, nothing happens. The person finishes getting gas and drives away. But sometimes, he did not finish the sentence. But I could see the fear in his eyes. I asked him who they were, but he just shook his head. He told me there were stories, legends about what happened to people who stayed too long after sunset. Disappearances that were never reported to the police. Bodies found weeks later in the deep woods, if they were found at all. The fuel pump clicked off automatically. My tank was full, but I would have to walk back to my truck to remove the nozzle and replace the fuel cap. 30 feet of open ground between the safety of the store and my cab. 30 feet with a dozen shadowy figures watching from the tree line. I asked the attendant if he could call the police, but he laughed bitterly. He told me that half the sheriff's department probably lived in those woods. That some of them might be standing out there right now, waiting to see what I would do. As I stood there trying to decide whether to run for my truck or wait until dawn, one of the shadows stepped forward into the parking lot lights. It was a man wearing hunting camouflage and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He was not looking at the store windows. He was looking directly at my truck. Then another figure emerged from the darkness, and another. They were not approaching the station, but they were forming a tighter circle around the property. I could see more clearly now that they were carrying things. Ropes, tools, items I did not want to identify. The attendant grabbed my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong for such a thin man. "There is a back door," he whispered. "It opens onto the service road behind the station. Your truck is too big, but there is a path through the woods that connects to Highway 259 about 2 miles north. If you can make it to that road, you might find help." But I could not abandon my truck. It contained everything I owned, all my belongings, my livelihood. Without it, I would be stranded in East Texas with no money and no way to get home. That was when I realized the truth. This was not random. These people had not just happened to notice a stranger passing through. They had been waiting, watching. They knew exactly when travelers would arrive and exactly how to trap them. The attendant saw the recognition in my eyes and nodded grimly. He told me that the gas station's credit card system was programmed to decline certain cards randomly. Cards belonging to people with names like Santos, or Patel, or Washington. The system forced them to come inside, to show their faces, to give the watchers time to gather in the woods. I asked him why he stayed, why he worked for people who used his station as bait for their hatred. He looked down at his hands and whispered that he had tried to leave once. They had burned down his house and killed his dog. They had made it clear that he could either help them or join the people who disappeared in the woods. One of the figures in the parking lot raised his hand and waved at the store window. It was not a friendly gesture. It was a signal. Within seconds, I could see more shadows emerging from the tree line on all sides of the station. There had to be 20 or 30 people surrounding us now. The attendant cocked his shotgun, but we both knew it would not be enough. He had 2 shells, and there were dozens of them. The best we could hope for was to make enough noise to scare them away, but I doubted these people were easily frightened. That was when I saw the Louisiana sedan parked near the building start its engine. The driver was pulling away, slowly and carefully, not wanting to attract attention from the figures in the woods. But as the car reached the edge of the parking lot, several of the shadows stepped into its path. The sedan stopped. I could hear muffled voices through the glass windows of the store, though I could not make out words. The conversation seemed to go on for several minutes. Then the car door opened, and a man stepped out with his hands raised. Even from a distance, I could see that he was black. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. The figures surrounded the man from Louisiana. There was a brief struggle. Then the group melted back into the darkness, and the sedan sat empty with its driver door hanging open. The attendant was breathing heavily now, his knuckles white as he gripped the shotgun. He told me that I had maybe 5 minutes before they came for me, that they would want to finish with the other traveler before dealing with the truck driver. I made my decision. I grabbed the shotgun from his hands, checked that both barrels were loaded, and headed for the back door. The attendant tried to stop me, but I pushed past him. If I was going to die in these East Texas woods, it would not be cowering in a gas station while innocent people were murdered outside. The back door opened onto a narrow gravel road that ran parallel to the highway. My truck was visible around the corner of the building, still connected to the diesel pump. I could see several figures standing near it now, examining the license plates and looking through the windows of the cab. I had one chance. If I could reach the truck and get it started before they realized what was happening, I might be able to drive through their line and escape onto the highway. The 18-wheeler was powerful enough to push through almost any obstacle, including pickup trucks and human beings. I sprinted around the corner of the building with the shotgun in my hands. The figures near my truck turned at the sound of my footsteps, but they were not expecting an armed man running toward them. I fired one barrel into the air, and the sound echoed through the pine forest like thunder. The effect was immediate. The shadowy figures scattered, diving behind cars and running for the tree line. But they did not flee entirely. They regrouped at the edge of the woods, watching and waiting. I yanked the fuel nozzle from my truck and threw it aside. Diesel fuel sprayed across the concrete, creating a slick puddle that reflected the fluorescent lights. I climbed into the cab and turned the key, praying that the engine would start immediately. The diesel engine roared to life, 18 cylinders of American-made power that had never sounded so beautiful. I threw the transmission into gear and released the air brakes. The truck lurched forward, tires squealing on the wet pavement. But the figures in the woods had anticipated my move. As I pulled away from the pumps, a pickup truck emerged from behind the station and blocked my path to the highway. 2 more vehicles appeared from the darkness, boxing me in on 3 sides. I had no choice but to ram through them. I downshifted into second gear and pressed the accelerator to the floor. 80,000 pounds of truck and trailer crashed into the pickup truck with a sound like a bomb exploding. Metal screamed against metal as I pushed the smaller vehicle aside and broke through onto Highway 296. In my mirrors, I could see the gas station falling away behind me, but the headlights of several vehicles were following. They were chasing me through the East Texas darkness, and I had no idea how far their territory extended or whether they had friends waiting up ahead. I drove for 20 miles without stopping, pushing the truck as fast as it would go on the winding forest roads. The pursuing vehicles gradually fell behind, unable to match the speed of my loaded 18-wheeler on the straight sections of highway. By the time I reached the lights of Marshall, Texas, I was alone on the road. But the story does not end there. 3 days later, I called the gas station from a truck stop in Oklahoma. I wanted to know if the attendant was safe, if the police had investigated what happened that night. The phone number had been disconnected. When I checked online, I found no record of a gas station at that location on Highway 296. I drove back to Jasper 6 months later, in broad daylight and with other truckers for company. The gas station was gone. In its place was an empty lot overgrown with weeds and pine saplings. There was no sign that a building had ever stood there, no concrete foundation or abandoned fuel pumps. But I found something else. In the woods behind where the station had been, Scattered among the fallen leaves and undergrowth were dozens of license plates from different states. Louisiana, New Mexico, California, all of them darkened with rust and age, as if they had been there for years. I still drive Highway 296 sometimes, but never after dark. And I have never found another trucker who remembers seeing a gas station at that location. Some of them think I imagined the whole thing, that exhaustion and paranoia got the better of me during a long night drive. But I know what I saw in those East Texas woods. I know there are places in America where the clock stopped in 1958, where hatred runs so deep that it creates its own reality. Places that exist only after sunset, where travelers who look different disappear into the darkness and are never seen again. The man from Louisiana with his hands raised in surrender haunts my dreams. I never learned his name, never found out what happened to him after the figures dragged him into the woods. But sometimes, when I am driving alone at night through small towns where Confederate flags still fly from courthouse squares, I think I see his face in my mirrors. And I remember that some roads in America are more dangerous after dark than others. Story 6. Foundation. He knew my mother, this maiden name, and he was smiling when he said it. I am a surveyor for the Louisiana Department of Transportation, and I spend my days mapping forgotten roads in rural parishes where GPS signals die and cell towers are just rumors. My name is Paul Mitchell, and what I found in the woods near Cusheta should have stayed buried with the rest of that abandoned hospital. The job seemed routine. Survey the old logging roads behind Highway 509 to determine if they could handle increased truck traffic from a new paper mill. Most of these dirt tracks had been carved out in the 1950s when the timber industry was booming, then left to rot when the companies moved operations to cheaper states. I had been working alone for 3 days, taking measurements and marking waypoints with my equipment. The August heat was brutal, even under the canopy of pine and oak trees, and the humidity made my clothes stick to my skin like wet fabric. On the third afternoon, I pushed deeper into the woods than my assignment required, following a particularly straight road that seemed to lead toward something significant. That was when I found the foundation. It sat in a clearing about 50 yards off the main logging road, a concrete rectangle roughly 40 feet by 60 feet with crumbling walls that rose about 3 feet above the ground. Weeds and small trees had grown up through cracks in the foundation, and the whole structure was slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Rusted metal pipes jutted up from the concrete at regular intervals, and I could see the remains of what looked like surgical equipment scattered in the debris. I checked my county maps, but there was no record of any building at this location. The area was marked as undeveloped forest land, with no historical structures noted. But the foundation was definitely the remains of a substantial building, and the medical equipment suggested it had been some kind of healthcare facility. I was photographing the ruins for my report when I noticed the footprints. They were fresh boot prints in the soft mud near the edge of the foundation, size 11 or 12, with a distinctive tread pattern that I recognized as military surplus combat boots. The prints circled the entire perimeter of the ruins, as if someone had been pacing around the foundation recently. Very recently, that was when I heard the whistling. It was coming from somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing, a simple melody that sounded like a children's song. The tune was familiar, but I could not place it immediately. The whistling stopped and started randomly, sometimes fading into the distance, sometimes seeming to come from much closer. I called out, thinking it might be another surveyor or a local hunter, but got no response. The whistling continued, now coming from a different direction entirely. It was as if the person making the sound was moving through the woods in a wide circle around the clearing, staying just out of sight among the trees. I decided to pack up my equipment and head back to the main road. Something about the situation felt wrong, and I had learned to trust my instincts after 15 years of working alone in remote locations. But as I gathered my surveying tools, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were more boot prints now, fresh ones, leading from the tree line to the foundation and back. Someone had approached the ruins while I was taking photographs, gotten close enough to see what I was doing, then retreated back into the woods. The whistling had stopped completely, but I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness between the trees. I shouldered my equipment bag and walked quickly back toward the logging road, trying not to look like I was fleeing. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, but I saw nothing except pine trees and Spanish moss. I made it back to my truck without incident, but as I drove away from the area, I could not shake the feeling that I had stumbled onto something I was not supposed to see. That night, in my motel room in Natchitoches, I researched the location online, trying to find some historical record of the building I had discovered. What I found was worse than I had imagined. The foundation was the remains of Coushatta State Hospital, a mental health facility that had operated from 1948 to 1973. The hospital had been closed following a scandal involving patient abuse and illegal medical experiments. Several patients had died under suspicious circumstances, and the state had ordered the building demolished and the records sealed. But according to the news articles I found, the demolition had never been completed. The contractors had removed most of the structure but left the foundation intact when funding ran out. The site had been abandoned and eventually forgotten, left to decay in the Louisiana woods. The articles mentioned something else that made my skin crawl. In the final years before the hospital closed, several staff members had reported seeing a patient who should not have been there. A man who appeared to be in his 30s, always smiling, who seemed to know intimate details about the other patients and staff members that he had no way of knowing. This patient had no admission records, no medical files, and no known identity. He appeared on ward rosters randomly and disappeared just as mysteriously. Security cameras from that era showed him walking the halls at night, approaching other patients and staff members with that constant smile, speaking to them in whispers that the audio equipment could never quite pick up. The last confirmed sighting was 3 days before the hospital closed permanently. A night janitor reported seeing this smiling man standing in the main hallway, looking directly at him. When the janitor approached, the man simply walked away, moving deeper into the building. The janitor followed but found only empty rooms and no sign of where the man had gone. I closed my laptop and tried to convince myself that it was just an old story, local folklore that had grown around the ruins of a forgotten hospital. But I could not forget those fresh boot prints, or the feeling of being watched from the tree line. The next morning, I drove back to the site to complete my survey work. I told myself it was professional obligation, that I needed to finish mapping the area to earn my fee. But the truth was that I had to know if what I had experienced the day before was real. The logging road looked different in the morning light. The shadows fell at strange angles, and the trees seemed thicker, more oppressive. When I reached the spot where I had parked the day before, I noticed something that had not been there previously. Someone had placed a small pile of stones beside the road, arranged in a perfect circle about 2 feet in diameter. The stones were smooth river rocks, the kind you might find along the Red River 20 miles away. They had been placed with deliberate care, as if marking the location for some purpose. I approached the foundation clearing with my equipment, but something felt fundamentally different about the place. The weeds around the ruins had been trampled down, and there were more boot prints everywhere. It looked like someone had spent considerable time there after I had left the day before. But it was what I found inside the foundation that really scared me. Someone had cleared away the debris and vegetation from a section of the concrete floor, revealing what looked like a maintenance access or cellar entrance. The metal cover had been pried open, and I could see wooden steps leading down into darkness. The opening had definitely not been visible the day before. I should have left immediately. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get back in my truck and drive away. But I am a surveyor, trained to document and map everything I encounter. I took out my flashlight and approached the opening in the floor. The wooden steps were old but solid, and they led down about 8 feet into what appeared to be a basement or storage area beneath the foundation. The walls were concrete block, and the air smelled of mold and decay. My flashlight beam revealed a small room with several doorways leading into adjoining chambers. That was when I saw him. He was standing in one of the doorways, about 15 feet away from me. A man in his 30s with dark hair and pale skin, wearing what looked like outdated hospital scrubs. He was smiling at me. A wide, genuine smile that never reached his eyes. And he was speaking my name, not just my first name, but my full name, Paul Robert Mitchell. Then he mentioned my address in Baton Rouge, my wife, this name, Sarah, the names of my 2 children, Emma and Jake. He recited these facts in a calm, friendly voice, as if he were introducing himself at a neighborhood barbecue. But it was what he said next that made me run. He told me about the argument Sarah and I had had 3 nights ago when I had called her from my motel room. He quoted things I had said word for word, private things that no one else could have known. He mentioned the birthday present I had hidden in our closet for Emma's upcoming party, a doll she had asked for that I had driven to 3 different stores to find. Then he told me about the speeding ticket I had gotten 2 months ago on Interstate 49, and how I had never mentioned it to Sarah because I was embarrassed about being pulled over. He knew the exact amount of the fine and the name of the state trooper who had written the citation. This was impossible. There was no way a stranger in an abandoned hospital basement could know these details about my personal life. But he was standing there smiling and reciting facts about me as if he were reading from a file folder. I scrambled up the wooden steps and ran back to my truck as fast as I could move with 40 pounds of surveying equipment on my back. My hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition, and I could hear the children's song being whistled again from somewhere in the woods around me. I drove straight to the Red River Parish Sheriff's office in Coushatta and reported what I had found. The deputy who took my statement was polite but clearly skeptical. He told me that teenagers sometimes played pranks around the old hospital ruins, and that homeless people occasionally used the basement for shelter. But when I described the man in the scrubs and the personal information he had possessed about me, the deputy's expression changed. He asked me to describe the man in detail, then disappeared into a back office for several minutes. When he returned, he was carrying a thin manila folder. Inside the folder was a black and white photograph from 1972. It showed a man in hospital scrubs, smiling at the camera. The face was exactly the same as the person I had encountered in the basement. The same dark hair, the same pale skin, the same unsettling smile. The deputy told me that this photograph had been taken during the final investigation of Coushatta State Hospital. It was the only known image of the mysterious patient who had appeared in the facility during its last months of operation. According to the hospital's incomplete records, this man had somehow gained access to confidential patient files and personal information about staff members. The investigation had concluded that he was probably a former employee who had developed an obsession with the hospital and was breaking in after hours to access records and harass people. But no one had ever been able to identify him or determine how he was getting inside the secured building. The deputy closed the folder and looked at me seriously. He told me that I was not the first person to encounter the smiling man at the hospital ruins. Over the past 30 years, hunters, hikers, and curiosity seekers had reported similar experiences. Always the same description, always the same unsettling knowledge of personal details he should not have possessed. Most people, the deputy said, were too embarrassed or frightened to file official reports. They convinced themselves it had been a hallucination or a prank, and they never returned to the area. But a few, like me, had been disturbed enough to seek help from law enforcement. I asked the deputy what he thought was really happening at the old hospital site. He was quiet for a long moment, then told me something that still keeps me awake at night. 3 months earlier, a graduate student from Louisiana State University had been researching the history of Coushatta State Hospital for her thesis. She had obtained permission to examine the site and had spent several days photographing and documenting the ruins. On her final day, she had discovered the basement entrance and had gone down to explore. She had never come back up. Her car was found parked beside the logging road, and her camera equipment was scattered around the foundation. But despite extensive searches by sheriff's deputies and state police, no trace of the student herself was ever found. The basement chambers had been thoroughly explored, but they contained nothing except old debris and standing water. The deputy handed me his business card and told me to call immediately if I had any further contact with the smiling man. He also strongly advised me never to return to the hospital site, alone or otherwise. I finished my survey work from memory and submitted my report without ever going back to the foundation. I recommended that the old logging roads be classified as unsuitable for commercial traffic, which effectively ensured that the area would remain undisturbed. But the story does not end there. 2 weeks after my encounter, I received a package at my home address with no return label. Inside was a photograph that had been taken with my own camera, showing me standing beside the basement entrance at the hospital ruins. I had not taken this picture. I had never even removed my camera from its case that day. In the background of the photograph, barely visible among the trees at the edge of the clearing, you can see a figure watching. A man in hospital scrubs, smiling directly at the camera. I moved my family to Texas a month later, telling Sarah that I had found a better job with a Dallas surveying firm. I have never told her the real reason we left Louisiana, and I have never been back to Red River Parish. But sometimes, late at night when I am lying in bed, I can hear that children's song being whistled outside our house. And I know that somewhere in the Louisiana woods, a smiling man is still watching from the tree line, learning things about people he should never know. Story 7. Text that saved my life. The phone buzzed 12 times before I finally looked at it. 12 missed calls from my mother at 3 in the morning should have been my first warning that something was terribly wrong. But nothing could have prepared me for the text message that followed. Help. Help me, they took everything, please come now. My hands shook as I read those words. My 70-year-old mother lived alone in the same house where I grew up, 20 minutes outside Columbus, Ohio. She never sent a text message in her life. Hell, she barely knew how to answer her phone half the time. But there it was, glowing on my screen in all capital letters, desperate and afraid. I threw on clothes and drove through empty suburban streets, my mind racing with possibilities. Home invasion, medical emergency, Alzheimer was finally taking hold of her sharp mind. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every dark intersection a potential crime scene I was too late to prevent. The house looked normal when I pulled into her driveway. Porch light on, front door intact, no broken windows or signs of struggle. But the silence felt wrong. My mother was a light sleeper who would have heard my car, would have been at the door before I could knock. I used my spare key and called out as I entered. The house smelled like her usual lavender air freshener mixed with the faint odor of the dinner she decooked hours earlier. Nothing seemed disturbed. The television was off, her reading glasses folded neatly on the coffee table next to a crossword puzzle she'd been working on. I found her in bed, sleeping peacefully. When I gently shook her awake, she looked at me with the confused expression of someone pulled from deep sleep. She asked what I was doing there at such an ungodly hour. I showed her the text message on my phone. Her face went white as she read it. She grabbed her own phone from the nightstand, fingers trembling as she navigated to her messages. There it was, sent from her number to mine at 3:17 a.m. The same desperate plea for help. But my mother swore she hadn't sent it. She remembered typing those exact words earlier that evening while watching the news. There'd been a story about break-ins in her neighborhood, and she'd been composing a message to send me in the morning, just to let me know she was being careful. But she'd fallen asleep before sending it, or so she thought. We checked her phone together. The message was definitely in her sent folder, timestamped just 40 minutes earlier. But she'd been asleep for hours by then. Deep, uninterrupted sleep that she insisted no one could have woken her from. I stayed with her until sunrise, both of us too unsettled to sleep. We checked every door and window, found them all locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been in the house. My mother seemed fine, just confused and embarrassed about the whole situation. As dawn broke over the quiet neighborhood, I began to feel foolish. Maybe she sent the text in her sleep. Maybe her medication had made her confused about the timeline. Maybe I overreacted to what was essentially a technical glitch. I kissed her goodbye around 7 in the morning and drove home, exhausted but relieved that she was safe. The morning commute was starting, and the streets filled with familiar suburban traffic. Everything felt normal again, until I turned onto my street. My front door was hanging open like a broken mouth. Even from half a block away, I could see that something was very wrong. I parked across the street and sat in my car for several minutes, staring at my house and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rational part of my brain said I should call the police. But a deeper, more primitive instinct told me to get out and look for myself. I needed to see what had been done to my home. The scene inside was methodical devastation. This wasn't random vandalism or a desperate drug addict looking for quick cash. Someone had systematically gone through every room, every drawer, every closet. They'd known exactly what they were looking for and had taken their time finding it. My television was still there. My laptop sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Even my wallet, which I'd forgotten on the coffee table, remained with all the cash intact. But my filing cabinet had been completely emptied. Every important document I owned was gone. Birth certificate, social security card, passport, bank statements, tax returns, insurance policies. My identity had been stolen in the most literal sense possible. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the realization that crept over me as I stood in my ransacked living room, pieces of my life scattered across the floor like confetti. Someone had known I wouldn't be home. Someone had known exactly when to strike, had counted on me being 20 minutes away, distracted and worried about my mother. The timing had been perfect. Too perfect. I called the police, and while I waited for them to arrive, I walked through my house trying to understand what had happened. In my bedroom, I found something that made my blood turn to ice water. On my nightstand, exactly where I would have left my phone if I had been sleeping, was a piece of paper with my mother's phone number written on it. Underneath the number, in handwriting that wasn't mine, were the words I'd seen in that desperate text message. Help me, they took everything, please come now. Someone had been in my house while I slept. They'd gone through my mother's contact information, found her number, and somehow sent that text from her phone. They lured me away from my home with surgical precision, using my love for my mother as the weapon. But how had they accessed her phone? How had they known she lived alone and slept deeply? How had they timed everything so perfectly that I received the message just as they were finishing their work? The police took my statement and dutifully wrote everything down, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Identity theft was common. Home invasions happened every day. But orchestrating both with such precision seemed beyond the capabilities of ordinary criminals. They were wrong. Over the next few weeks, I discovered the true scope of what had been done to me. Credit cards opened in my name. Bank accounts accessed with information stolen from my files. Someone was living my financial life in parallel, making purchases and taking out loans while I scrambled to prove my own identity to customer service representatives who treated me like a fraudster. But the more I investigated, the more I realized this wasn't about money. The amounts stolen were relatively small, the purchases seemingly random. It was as if someone was experimenting with my identity, testing how far they could push before I noticed. The breakthrough came when I finally got security footage from my bank. A woman I'd never seen before had walked in with my identification and withdrawn money from my account. But what chilled me wasn't her unfamiliarity. It was how much she looked like me. Same height, same build, same hair color. From a distance, or to someone who didn't know me well, we could have been siblings. She studied me, learned my mannerisms, even copied the way I signed my name. The signature on the withdrawal slip was perfect, better than I could have done myself. I started checking other security cameras in places where my identity had been used. Gas stations, grocery stores, department stores. Always the same woman, always moving with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. She was living my life better than I was. The police couldn't do much with video footage of someone who looked like me using identification that belonged to me. The bank's fraud department treated it as a routine case, more concerned with their liability than my growing paranoia. Everyone kept telling me these things happened all the time, that I'd recover from it eventually. But they didn't understand what it felt like to see someone else wearing your face, spending your money, living in the shadow of your existence like some kind of financial doppelganger. I hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Marcus who specialized in identity theft cases. He looked at my evidence with the serious attention it deserved and asked questions that made me realize how much I'd been missing. How had she known about my relationship with my mother? How had she gained access to both our phones simultaneously? How had she mapped out my daily routine well enough to predict exactly when I'd be home and when I wouldn't? Marcus suggested something that hadn't occurred to me. What if this wasn't random? What if I had been specifically targeted, studied, and chosen for reasons that went beyond simple financial gain? We started looking into my background, my job, my social media presence. I work as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Columbus. I have access to client financial information, tax records, and banking details for dozens of small businesses. If someone wanted to commit large-scale financial fraud, my identity would be the perfect key to unlock that information. But when we checked with my employer, we discovered something that made my hands shake just like they had when I first read that text message from my mother. Someone had already been there. A woman matching my description had visited the office the week before my house was robbed. She'd spoken with the receptionist, claiming to be me, saying she needed to pick up some files for a client meeting. The receptionist, who barely knew me, had let her into the building and even helped her locate my desk. She had access to everything. Client files, computer passwords I'd written down, keys to filing cabinets that contained sensitive financial information. She hadn't just stolen my identity. She'd stolen my entire professional life. Marcus and I spent the next month following a trail that led through a dozen compromised client accounts and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent transactions. The woman who looked like me had been using my identity to systematically rob every person and business I'd ever worked with. But the trail went cold at a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The address led to an empty unit that had been rented under my name, paid for with money stolen from my accounts. When we searched it, we found something that finally made everything clear. The walls were covered with photographs of me, pictures taken from a distance as I went about my daily life. Me leaving work, me grocery shopping, me visiting my mother. Hundreds of images documenting my routine with obsessive precision. In the center of this gallery was a mirror, and written across it in red lipstick were words that made my blood freeze. "Thank you for the life. I'll take better care of it than you did." She was gone, of course. The apartment had been abandoned for weeks, cleaned out so thoroughly that even the landlord didn't remember what she looked like. The police classified it as a cold case, just another identity theft that had gotten out of hand. But I knew better. This hadn't been random, and it wasn't over. 3 months later, I moved across the country to Oregon. New job, new address, new phone number. I told myself I was starting fresh, leaving the nightmare behind in Ohio. Last week, my new neighbor mentioned seeing me at the grocery store earlier that day. I'd been at work all afternoon, had the time cards to prove it. Yesterday, my mother called to ask why I sent her such a strange text message in the middle of the night. A message I never sent. About needing help. About someone taking everything. Tonight, as I write this, my phone keeps buzzing with missed calls from numbers I don't recognize. I am afraid to answer. I am afraid to look at the messages. Because I am starting to understand that the text from my mother hadn't been a trick to lure me away from home. It had been a warning. Story 8. Crawling dead. Something is crawling up my leg right now as I tell you this story. I can feel it moving under my skin, slow and deliberate, like fingers made of ice water tracing patterns along my bones. It started 3 weeks ago in Clarksville, Tennessee, and it hasn't stopped. The doctors say there's nothing there, but I know better. I know exactly what's crawling inside me, and I know why. I never believed in ghosts until I spent a night researching Martin V. Ingram's grave at Greenwood Cemetery. Now I understand that some books should never be written, some stories should never be told, and some dead men should never be disturbed. My name is David Chan, and I am a freelance journalist specializing in American folklore and urban legends. I've been commissioned to write an article about the Bell Witch legend for a paranormal magazine. Nothing more than a quick 1,000-word piece about Tennessee, its most famous ghost story. It should have been easy money. The Bell Witch tale is well documented. In the early 1800s, the Bell family of Adams, Tennessee, was terrorized by an entity that spoke, moved objects, and eventually killed the family patriarch, John Bell. The story became legendary throughout the South, passed down through generations of storytellers who added their own embellishments to an already incredible tale. But I wanted more than just the standard retelling. I wanted to find something new, some angle that hadn't been explored in the hundreds of articles already written about the Bell Witch. That's what led me to Martin V. Ingram. Ingram was a newspaper publisher who, in 1894, decided to document the definitive version of the Bell Witch story. He spent months interviewing descendants of the Bell family, collecting sworn testimonies, and gathering historical documents. His book, An Authenticated History of the Bell Witch, was supposed to be the final word on the subject. But something went wrong during the printing process. The research I'd done suggested that Ingram experienced supernatural interference while producing his book. Printing presses would malfunction without explanation. Type would rearrange itself overnight, changing words and sentences. Workers reported feeling watched in the printing shop, and several quit after experiencing what they described as invisible hands touching them while they worked. Ingram persisted, driven by what his contemporaries described as an unhealthy obsession with getting the story exactly right. He reprinted chapters multiple times, each version slightly different from the last, as if he was receiving new information from sources that couldn't be interviewed. The book was finally published in 1894, but Ingram died just 2 years later under circumstances his family described as mysterious. He'd been found in his printing shop, collapsed over a manuscript he'd been working on. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but witnesses reported that his body showed signs of having been crawled on. Dozens of small marks covered his skin, as if something had been moving across him for hours. Martin V. Ingram was buried in Clarksville's Greenwood Cemetery, and according to local tour guides, his grave has been a site of paranormal activity ever since. Visitors report feeling something crawling on them while standing near his headstone. The sensation doesn't stop when they leave the cemetery. That should have been enough to keep me away. But I am a journalist, and journalists are curious by nature. I wanted to see Ingram's grave for myself, maybe spend some time there and see if I could experience whatever it was that others had reported. I drove to Clarksville on a Thursday evening in October, when the leaves were just starting to turn and the air had that crisp quality that makes you think of Halloween and ghost stories. Greenwood Cemetery sits on a hill overlooking the Cumberland River, surrounded by old oak trees that cast long shadows even in daylight. The cemetery office was closed, but the gates were open. I parked near the entrance and walked among the headstones, using my phone as flashlight to read names and dates. Greenwood is an old cemetery, with graves dating back to the Civil War era. Some of the headstones are elaborate Victorian monuments, while others are simple markers that time and weather have worn nearly smooth. I found Martin V. Ingram's grave in the older section, marked by a modest granite headstone that listed his birth and death dates along with the words, publisher and truth seeker. Someone had left flowers recently, though they were withered and brown from the autumn chill. I set up my recording equipment and notebook, planning to spend an hour or two at the gravesite, documenting any unusual experiences for my article. The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the oak trees and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. For the first 30 minutes, nothing happened. I made notes about the atmosphere, the history of the cemetery, and my own expectations about what I might experience. The rational part of my brain was relieved that nothing supernatural was occurring. The storyteller in me was disappointed. Then I felt it, a light touch on my ankle. So subtle I initially dismissed it as a leaf or a blade of grass moved by the wind. But the touch came again, more deliberate this time, like something small exploring the fabric of my jeans. I looked down but saw nothing in the beam of my flashlight. The grass around Ingram's grave was undisturbed, no insects or small animals that might account for what I was feeling. But the sensation continued, a slow crawling movement that began at my ankle and started working its way up my leg. My first instinct was to brush at my leg, to dislodge whatever was causing the sensation. But when I moved my hand down, I felt nothing. No spider, no bug, nothing physical that could be removed. Yet the crawling continued, now reaching my knee. I stood up quickly, shaking my leg and brushing at my clothes. The movement stopped immediately, but I could feel something watching me from the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. The air around Ingram's grave had grown noticeably colder, and I could see my breath forming small clouds of vapor. I should have left then. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to pack up my equipment and drive away from Greenwood Cemetery as fast as my rental car could take me. But I was a journalist, and this was exactly the kind of experience I had come looking for. I sat back down and waited. The crawling sensation returned within minutes, starting again at my ankle but moving faster this time. It felt like dozens of small legs moving across my skin, invisible insects exploring every inch of my body with methodical precision. The sensation reached my waist, then my chest, finally stopping at my throat where it seemed to pause and consider. I forced myself to remain still, to document what was happening even as every nerve in my body urged me to run. I spoke into my recording device, describing the sensations in as much detail as I could manage. My voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the underlying tension. That is when I noticed the change in the air around me. The wind had stopped completely, leaving the cemetery in absolute silence. But underneath that silence, I could hear something else. A sound so faint it might have been my imagination, but growing stronger by the moment. Scratching, like fingernails on paper or claws on wood. A rhythmic scratching that seemed to come from the ground beneath Ingram's headstone. I aimed my flashlight at the grave, and what I saw there made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped the light. The earth around the headstone was moving. Not dramatically, not like something was digging its way out of the ground. More like the soil was breathing, rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. With each rise and fall, the scratching sound grew louder, and the crawling sensation on my body intensified. I finally understood what was happening to me, and the realization was more terrifying than any ghost or monster could have been. Martin V. Ingram had spent his final years obsessed with documenting the truth about the Bell Witch. He persisted despite supernatural interference, despite warnings, despite the toll it was taking on his health and sanity. He died trying to get the story exactly right. But what if he never stopped? What if death hadn't ended his research, only changed the methods he used to gather information? The crawling sensation I was feeling wasn't random. It was purposeful, investigative. Something was studying me, learning about me, gathering data in the same way a journalist might interview a source. And that something had been doing it to others for over a century, collecting stories and experiences from everyone who visited its grave. I was being researched. The thought was so disturbing that I finally gave in to my instincts and ran. I grabbed my equipment and sprinted through the cemetery toward my car, the crawling sensation following me every step of the way. Even as I drove out of Clarksville, doing 80 on dark country roads, I could feel something moving under my skin. That was 3 weeks ago, and the crawling hasn't stopped. It's gotten worse. Actually, what started as a light touch has become a constant presence, moving through my body like it is mapping every nerve, every muscle, every bone. I've seen doctors, dermatologists, neurologists. They run every test imaginable, but they can't find anything wrong with me. Because there's nothing physically there to find. But I know what is happening. Martin V. Ingram is still researching, still gathering information, still trying to document the truth. And somehow, I've become part of his collection. The worst part is that I am not the only one. They found online forums where other people describe similar experiences after visiting graves of writers, journalists, and historians. Always the same sensation, always the feeling of being studied and cataloged by something that should have stopped caring about research when it died. We all sources now, living documents in some massive supernatural archive that spans generations and geography. Every sensation, every thought, every moment of our lives is being recorded by researchers who never learn that some stories are too dangerous to tell. They stopped sleeping, stopped eating regularly, stopped doing much of anything except trying to understand what is happening to me. My editor has been calling, asking about the Bell Witch article one never finished. They tried to write it several times, but every time I start typing, the crawling intensifies, as if whatever is inside me is guiding my hands toward a version of the truth I'm not supposed to know. Maybe that is the point. Maybe Martin V. Ingram and the others like him are still trying to get their stories exactly right, using us as unwilling collaborators in research that should have ended with their deaths. Or maybe I am going insane, and the crawling sensation is just my mind, its way of processing trauma and stress. Maybe there is nothing supernatural about any of this, and I'm just another journalist who spent too much time alone in a cemetery, looking for ghost stories that don't exist. But right now, as I finish telling you this story, I can feel something moving up my spine toward my brain. And for the first time in 3 weeks, the sensation feels different. Not random or investigative, but purposeful and final. I think Martin V. Ingram has finished his research on me. I think he is ready to publish his findings. Story 9. Bell Witch Road, the GPS died exactly when I needed it most. Highway 76 stretched ahead like a black tongue through Tennessee darkness, and my phone screen had gone completely blank 3 miles back. No signal bars, no battery icon, nothing but that eerie blue glow that meant the device was somehow still alive but utterly useless. I should have stayed on the interstate. Should have listened when my brother Mike warned me about taking back roads through Adams County after midnight. But gas was cheaper out here, and I had another 8 hours to drive before reaching my new job in Nashville. The corporate relocation package covered moving expenses, but not enough to waste money on overpriced truck stop fuel. Now I was paying for that decision in sweat and growing panic. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through absolute darkness. No streetlights, no house lights, just twisted oak trees pressing against the roadside like arthritic fingers reaching for my rental car. The radio had been nothing but static for the last 20 minutes, occasionally breaking into fragments of what sounded like old-time gospel music before dissolving back into white noise. That is when I saw the sign. Weather-beaten wood, hand-painted letters barely visible in my high beams, Bell Witch Cave 2 miles. An arrow pointed down a dirt road that disappeared into thick forest. The name sent ice water through my veins. Every American kid grows up hearing whispers about the Bell Witch, the only documented case in United States history where a supernatural entity was legally blamed for a human death. Adams, Tennessee. The Bell family. John Bell, poisoned by something that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite anything that belonged in this world. I pressed harder on the accelerator. Whatever tourism trap they built around that legend, I wanted no part of it at 1 a.m. But the engine began to sputter. The fuel gauge needle hovered just above empty, though I could have sworn it showed a quarter tank when I passed through the last town. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the car lurched forward in uneven bursts. The headlights flickered once, twice, then steadied. A gas station materialized ahead like an oasis. Hand-painted sign read, Ezra's last stop, with smaller text underneath. Open 24 hours, since 1920. The building looked like it hadn't been updated since that date. Single island with 2 ancient pumps. Fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered inside a small store attached to what might have been this house. I coasted into the gravel lot, grateful for any sign of civilization. The place felt wrong immediately. Too quiet, too still. The air itself seemed heavier here, pressing against my chest with each breath. An old man emerged from the store before I even shut off the engine. Thin as a scarecrow, wearing overalls that might have been blue once but had faded to the color of old bones. His eyes were the palest gray I'd ever seen, almost colorless in the harsh fluorescent glare. "Evening," he called out, his voice carrying an odd accent I couldn't place. "You look lost." I climbed out of the car, legs stiff from driving. "Just need gas. GPS went dead about 10 miles back. They do that around here." He moved to the pump with surprising speed for someone who looked ancient. "Electronics done, much like this particular stretch of county. Something about the minerals and the soil, they say." The way he emphasized, "they say," made my skin crawl. Like he knew better but wasn't telling. "You wouldn't happen to know the quickest way back to the interstate?" I asked, watching him work the pump with practiced ease. The gas flowed slower than normal, making soft gurgling sounds that reminded me uncomfortably of someone drowning. "Oh, sure, but not tonight, son. Road is washed out about 3 miles east. Been that way since the storm last week. County says they'll fix it, but you know how that goes." He gestured vaguely toward the darkness. "You'll want to head back west, then take the old Bell Road north. Connects up with Highway 41 eventually." Bell Road. Of course it did. "Is that anywhere near the Bell Witch Cave?" I tried to keep my voice casual, but something in his expression shifted. His pale eyes seemed to focus on me with new intensity. "You know about that? Do you?" He finished pumping and hung up the nozzle with deliberate care. Most folks nowadays never heard of John Bell and his troubles. History gets forgotten easy when it's the kind of history nobody wants to remember. I handed him 2 20s, hoping cash would speed things along. "Just curious. Heard stories growing up." "Stories?" He pocketed the bills without offering change. "That what they recalling it now?" "Stories." He walked toward the store, then paused at the door. "You drive careful on Bell Road, son. Especially tonight." "Why especially tonight?" But he already disappeared inside. I could see him through the grimy windows, moving around behind the counter. But when I followed him in to get my change, the store was empty. Completely empty. Shelves lined the walls, but they held nothing except dust and cobwebs. The cash register looked like it belonged in a museum, with brass keys and an ornate metal design that screamed early 1900s. "Hello." My voice echoed strangely in the small space. "Sir." Silence. I backed toward the door, every instinct screaming that I needed to leave immediately. But the man appeared again as I reached the threshold, materializing from what must have been a back room I hadn't noticed. "Forget something?" he asked pleasantly, as if nothing unusual had happened. "My change." He counted out bills and coins with meticulous precision. "Tell me, son, you ever hear how John Bell died?" I wanted to lie, to say no and get back in my car and drive anywhere but down Bell Road. Instead, I found myself answering honestly. "Poisoned. By the witch. Poisoned. Yes. But not how you might think." He leaned across the counter, his colorless eyes boring into mine. December 19th, 1820. John Bell took to his bed with strange convulsions. His family found him in terrible pain, tongue swollen black, unable to speak. When they searched for medicine in his room, they found a small vial of dark liquid. Nobody knew where it came from. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting moving shadows across his weathered face. The doctor tried to test the liquid on the family cat. 1 drop on its tongue, and the poor creature went into seizures, died within minutes. That is when they knew for certain what had killed John Bell. But here is the part they put in the tourist books. "Son." When they looked for that vial again, it was gone, vanished, and from somewhere in the house, they heard laughing. High, sweet laughter like a woman's voice, but wrong somehow. Too sharp, too knowing. My hands were shaking now, and I couldn't make them stop. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Bell Road runs right past the old Bell property, past the cave where she lived, where some folks say she lives still." He straightened up, suddenly looking less like a harmless old man and more like something carved from ancient wood. And because tonight is December 19th, I grabbed my change and ran. The car started on the third try, engine turning over with reluctant coughs that sounded almost like protests. I spun gravel pulling out of that parking lot, not caring about the noise or the dramatic exit. Every second I spent in that place felt like borrowing time I couldn't afford to lose. Bell Road stretched ahead exactly as he described. 2 lanes of cracked asphalt winding through forest that seemed to press closer with each passing mile. My headlights picked out details I didn't want to see. Trees with bark stripped away in long, claw-like gouges. Fence posts leaning at impossible angles, as if something had twisted them for sport. And always, just beyond the reach of my lights, the suggestion of movement. Shadows that shifted when they should have been still. The radio crackled to life without warning, making me jump hard enough to swerve slightly into the oncoming lane. A woman, its voice emerged from the static, singing in a language I didn't recognize. The melody was beautiful and terrible, rising and falling like a lament. I reached for the volume control, but the moment my fingers touched the knob, the singing stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard something else. Another car engine, somewhere behind me. I checked the rearview mirror but saw only darkness. No headlights, but the sound was definitely there, a low rumble that seemed to pace itself exactly to my speed. I pressed the accelerator. The invisible car behind me accelerated too. I slowed down. It slowed down. When I pulled over to the shoulder and stopped completely, the engine sound faded away, leaving only the tick of my cooling engine and the whisper of wind through the trees. My phone had come back to life, showing full bars and normal battery levels. I tried calling my brother Mike, needing to hear a familiar voice, but the call went straight to static. Not voicemail, just that white noise hiss that meant the signal was being interfered with somehow. I was about to pull back onto the road when I saw the historical marker. It stood maybe 50 yards ahead, just visible in my headlights. Official-looking brown metal sign with the Tennessee state seal. I drove closer, close enough to read the white lettering, Bell Farm Historic Site, on this property from 1817 to 1821. The Bell family experienced supernatural persecution by an entity known as the Bell Witch. The haunting culminated in the death of John Bell on December 19, 1820. This remains the only case in American history where a spirit was legally found responsible for a human death. Bell Witch Cave, located 500 yards south of this marker, continues to be a site of unexplained phenomena. 500 yards south? I looked in that direction and saw a narrow dirt path branching off from the main road. No lights, no signs of modern activity. Just darkness between the trees that seemed somehow darker than the regular darkness surrounding it. I should have kept driving. Instead, I found myself turning onto that dirt path, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down at accident scenes. My rational mind screamed warnings, but something stronger overrode those warnings. A compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. The path was rougher than I expected. My rental car bounced and scraped over ruts and rocks, suspension groaning with each impact. Branches scraped against the windows like fingernails on glass. The headlights swept back and forth as I navigated the winding trail, occasionally catching glimpses of structures in the woods. Old foundations, collapsed chimneys, the remains of buildings that had stood when Tennessee was still frontier territory. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the path opened into a small clearing. At the far end stood a wooden building that looked like it might have been a visitor center once upon a time. Dark windows stared back at my headlights. Weeds grew up through cracks in what had once been a paved parking area. And there, maybe 100 feet beyond the building, was the cave. The entrance was smaller than I imagined. A rough opening in a limestone outcropping, maybe 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. But something about it made my stomach clench with primal fear. It looked less like a natural cave opening and more like a wound in the earth that had never properly healed. I sat in the car with the engine running, staring at that dark mouth and the rock. Every logical thought told me to turn around and leave immediately. But logic seemed to be failing me tonight. The compulsion that had brought me here was stronger than ever, pulling me toward that opening like gravity. The engine died. I turned the key. Nothing, not even the clicking sound of a dead battery. The electrical systems were completely unresponsive. Dashboard dark. Headlights extinguished. In the sudden blackness, the cave entrance disappeared, leaving only the faint outline of trees against slightly lighter sky. Then I heard the singing again. It came from the direction of the cave, That same beautiful, terrible melody I heard on the radio. But this time I could make out words, or what might have been words in some archaic dialect that my brain couldn't quite process. The voice was definitely female, with a quality that made me think of honey poured over broken glass. Sweet and dangerous. I fumbled for my phone, grateful when the screen lit up and provided a small circle of light. The camera app opened easily enough, and I found myself taking pictures of the cave entrance, though I couldn't have said why. The flash illuminated the clearing in stark white bursts, creating a strobe effect that made everything look like stop-motion animation. In the third or fourth flash, I saw something moving near the cave entrance. A figure in white, there for just the instant of illumination, gone in the darkness between flashes. Human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too tall, moving in ways that suggested joints bending in directions joints shouldn't T-bend. I kept taking pictures, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. Flash after flash after flash, trying to catch another glimpse of whatever I'd seen. The singing grew louder, no longer beautiful but sharp and mocking, like laughter disguised as melody. In one flash, the figure was closer. In the next, closer still. By the fifth flash, it was right outside my passenger window. I screamed and dropped the phone. In the darkness, I heard a sound like fingernails tracing across glass. Slow, deliberate scratches that seemed to spell out patterns I almost recognized. The singing had stopped, replaced by something worse. Whispering. Multiple voices speaking in overlapping whispers, too soft to understand but filled with malevolent amusement. My phone had landed on the passenger seat, screen still glowing. I grabbed it and immediately tried calling 911, but before I could hit send, the screen changed. Instead of my contact list, I was looking at a photo I'd never taken. It showed the interior of my car from outside the passenger window. I could see myself in the driver's seat, face pale with terror, eyes wide and staring. But there was someone in the passenger seat beside me. A woman with impossibly long hair that seemed to move independent of any breeze, wearing a white dress that looked like it belonged in the early 1800s. She was smiling. I looked to my right. The passenger seat was empty. I looked back at the phone. In the photo, the woman was leaning closer to my ear, as if whispering something. The whispers around the car grew louder, no longer unintelligible. I could make out fragments now, spoken in that same archaic dialect but somehow familiar. As if I heard these words in dreams I'd forgotten. John Bell thought he could ignore me, the voices said in unison. Thought his prayers and his Bible would keep him safe. But poison is poison, whether it comes from a vial or from words spoken in the dark. The scratching on the windows grew more insistent. Not random now, but forming letters. I could feel them being carved into the glass even though I couldn't see the figure doing the carving. You know what day it is, the voices continued. You know why you here? Some anniversaries demand celebration. I tried the ignition again, turning the key with desperate force that threatened to snap it off in the lock. Nothing. The engine wouldn't even attempt to turn over. Please, I whispered to the darkness. I didn't need to come here. I just got lost. The laughter that answered me was worse than the singing had been. High and sweet and completely inhuman, coming from all directions at once. Through the scratched windows, I caught glimpses of movement. Multiple figures now, circling the car like predators evaluating prey. Lost, the voices repeated mockingly. Oh, but you, not lost. Dear one, you, exactly where you need to be, where you are always meant to be. My phone buzzed with an incoming text message. From my own number. The message read, look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to. Every survival instinct screamed against it. But my eyes moved to the mirror anyway, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The backseat wasn't empty anymore. She sat directly behind me, close enough that I could feel cold breath on the back of my neck. The woman from the photo, but worse in 3 dimensions. Her skin had the waxy pallor of something long dead, and her eyes were pools of darkness that seemed to extend far deeper than any human skull could contain. When she smiled, I saw teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, arranged in rows like a shark's mouth. Hello, John, she said, and her voice was exactly like the singing, beautiful and terrible and wrong. My name isn't John, I managed to whisper. Tonight it is. She leaned forward, her cold breath making me shiver. Tonight you get to play the part my dear John Bell played 200 years ago. the unwilling recipient of my special attention. I couldn't to move, couldn't to turn around to face her directly, could only stare at her reflection in the mirror. She reached up with one impossibly long-fingered hand and traced patterns in the condensation her breath had left on the back window. "Do you know what poison tastes like?" she asked conversationally. John Bell never had a chance to tell anyone. The paralysis took his voice first, you see. But his eyes spoke volumes in those final moments. Something appeared in my peripheral vision. A small glass vial, sitting on the dashboard where nothing had been moments before. Dark liquid sloshed inside as if agitated by an invisible hand. "Drink," she commanded, and for the first time, her sweet voice carried the unmistakable authority of something ancient and powerful. "Drink, and join the celebration." I tried to refuse, tried to push the compulsion away through sheer force of will. But my hand was already moving, reaching for the vial with mechanical precision. My fingers closed around the smooth glass, and I could feel the liquid inside radiating cold like a chunk of ice. "That is it," she crooned. "Just like John Bell, just like all the others who found their way here on this most special of nights." "Others? How many others?" The vial was almost to my lips when I heard a new sound. A car engine, approaching fast along the dirt path. Headlights swept through the trees, growing brighter by the second. The woman in the back seat hissed like an angry cat, her reflection wavering in the mirror as if she were made of smoke. "No," she snarled. "Not tonight. Not when we were so close." The approaching vehicle burst into the clearing with a spray of gravel and dust. It was a pickup truck, rust-eaten and ancient, with a light bar across the roof that lit up the entire area like daylight. I could see the cave entrance clearly now, and the figures that had been circling my car. There were dozens of them, all dressed in clothes from different eras, all bearing the same waxy pallor and two sharp smiles. They scattered like cockroaches when the light hit them, dissolving into shadow and retreating toward the cave. The woman in my backseat let out a shriek of rage that made my ears ring, then vanished as suddenly as she disappeared. The truck, its doors slammed, and I heard boots on gravel. A voice called out, familiar despite the circumstances. "Son, you all right in there?" It was the old man from the gas station, Ezra. He approached my car slowly, a shotgun cradled in his arms with the casual familiarity of someone who carried weapons his entire life. "Don, to move sudden-like," he advised, and Don, to look toward the cave. She was still there, just waiting for the lights to go out. My hand was still wrapped around the vial, which had grown so cold it burned. With tremendous effort, I managed to set it back on the dashboard. "How did you know I was here?" I asked through chattering teeth. "Same way I know every fool who takes Bell Road on December 19th, he replied grimly. "She calls to has for 200 years. Most don't make it this far, turn back before they reach the cave. But some, like you, got to see for themselves." He reached through my window and plucked the vial from the dashboard, handling it with a pair of thick work gloves. The liquid inside had turned completely black, and I swear I could see shapes moving in it like living things. "What is it?" I whispered. "Concentrated hate," he said simply. "Distilled malice, the kind of poison that kills more than just the body." He dropped the vial into a lead-lined box he produced from his jacket. "John Bell drank something similar. Took 3 days to die," and she laughed the whole time. My car engine turned over on the first try, headlights blazing back to life. The dashboard clock showed 3:17 a.m. I'd been in the clearing for less than an hour, though it felt like I lived through several lifetimes. "Follow me out," Ezra instructed. "Stay close, Don, to look back, and whatever you do, Don, to stop until you reach the main road." I did exactly as he said, keeping my eyes locked on his taillights as we wound back through the forest. The path seemed longer on the return trip, with more twists and turns than I remembered. Several times I caught movement in my peripheral vision, figures keeping pace with our vehicles just beyond the reach of the headlights. But I didn't look directly at them, didn't give them the attention they craved. When we finally reached Bell Road, Ezra pulled over and walked back to my car. He looked older than he had at the gas station, worn down by whatever he'd seen in that clearing. "You can make it to the interstate from here," he said. "Take Route 76 east, then south on 265. Should put you in Nashville by dawn." "What about you?" I asked. "Are you going back?" He glanced toward the dirt path, expression grim. "Someone has got to. She gets restless when she doesn't get what she so takes it out on the locals if strangers don't to satisfy her hunger. He tapped the lead box in his jacket, but the got ways of keeping her contained, at least for a while. How long have you been doing this? Long enough. He started walking back to his truck, then paused. Word of advice, son. Don, tell nobody about tonight. They believe you anyway, and some stories are better left untold. The Bell Witch feeds on attention same as she feeds on fear. Less folks know about her, safer everyone is. I watched him drive back down that dark path until his taillights disappeared completely. Then I pointed my car toward the interstate and drove like hell, not stopping until I saw the familiar glow of Nashville, the skyline on the horizon. 3 months later, I tried researching Ezra's last stop online. No record of it anywhere. No business license. No reviews. No mention in any directory. According to Google Maps, there's nothing but empty forest where that gas station stood. I still have the photos I took that night, stored on my phone where I can, to seem to delete them no matter how many times I try. They show the cave entrance, the clearing, my terrified face behind the steering wheel. But the passenger seat is empty in every single shot. Whatever I saw that night, whatever sat behind me and spoke in that terrible sweet voice, doesn't show up on digital cameras. Except in one photo, the last one I took, just before Ezra arrived. It shows the cave entrance, but carved into the limestone above the opening are letters that weren't there before. Fresh scratches that spell out a message in neat, deliberate script. Until next December 19th. I marked my calendar. Next year, I'll be somewhere else that night. Somewhere far from Tennessee, far from any back roads that might lead to places that shouldn't exist. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone after dark, I hear that singing on the radio. Beautiful and terrible and patient as death itself, reminding me that some appointments are harder to break than others. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A woman in white, smiling with too many teeth, counting down the days until our next meeting. The Bell Witch is patient. She has had 200 years to perfect her patience, but she hasn't forgotten. She never forgets.